All right. How are we doing today? Yeah, good. Sounds good. Summer is an interesting reality for me because like I feel like this is a family. I always have felt like this church is a family. And then what happens during summer is our family kind of scatters a little bit and goes on little vacations and trips, and then they come back and you don't see people for like 3 weeks. You feel like you haven't seen them forever, right? And then you're like, oh, so excited again, right? Phil walked in this morning and was like, yes! Because it just felt like, it's just been too long since I've been hanging out with my brother. So summer is a great time. I think it really helps remind us of why this is such a special thing and why this is worth fighting for. So let's talk about our very uplifting book, Ecclesiastes. Actually, you know what? It's starting to turn, isn't it? A little bit? Starting to turn. So we're gonna talk today about Ecclesiastes 4. Like I said, we're gonna take these in big chunks, and so we can't go through everything. And I have my own issues when it comes to stuff like this. I have to remind myself to stay at this level and not get way down here. And so today I'm going to try to do that with you. Our sermon today is called "The Illusion of the Power of One is the Loneliest Number." I know I just put so many things together there, but you know what? And there are so many song lyrics in my stuff today. It's really stupid, but it does speak to this. The illusion of the power of one is the loneliest number, and that there's this idea of the power of one, and maybe that is an illusion. Maybe power itself is an illusion for us in this world, and we have to deal with what that looks like. So let's go to Ecclesiastes 4, wherever you're at. We're going to read the whole chapter together, and then we will pick back through it. For those of you who are with us today on YouTube Live, I apologize. I can't see it today because my phone died, which has become like this recurring theme lately. And I'm sure somebody will tell me that's because I got the wrong kind of phone. But yes, all right. So let's read Ecclesiastes. Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them, and power was on the side of their oppressors, but they had no one to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living, but better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a person and his neighbor. This too is futility and striving after the wind. One handful of rest is better than two fistfuls of labor and striving after wind. Then I looked again at futility under the sun. There was a man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother. Yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom do I labor and deprive myself of pleasure? This too is futility, and it is an unhappy task. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for the labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion, but woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. A poor yet wise youth is better than an old and foolish king, who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all those living under the sun move to the side of the second youth who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them. Even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him, for this too is futility and striving after the wind. Amen? Plenty of verses in there that you have heard before, probably completely out of context, but used many times. Yes? 3-stranded cord, all these things that we hear, right? But not attached to the things that we don't like to talk about in North American churches like oppression. Yeah. Which we have to talk about because the Word of God tells us that there is such a thing. There is. It also tells us there is such a thing as a people who have power over another people. I know it's a very, very liberal Koheleth today, isn't he? But we're going to have to deal with that truth, aren't we? And what I was thinking about today is this week a lot is that power dynamic and the idea of power, and I'm going to switch it a little bit, call it dominion, because that's kind of what God called us to. And so I want us to just, before we dig into this, I want us to be reminded once again of what it says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule.'" Once again, let them rule. All right, so there is a community that's supposed to rule. Okay, and then it says, "Over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth." What I want you to see is that this is God's desired and designed order for rule and dominion on the earth. Okay, this is what it looks like. Human beings ruling together, sharing the responsibility of God's call, understood, to manage all that He created. It is not humans to rule over humans. In fact, it is God who has dominion over human beings and commissions them to have dominion over His creation. Make sense? I'm just reminding us of God's original design for His world. Okay? Because unless we acknowledge that, we have a problem understanding why power has become such a problem. And why it's not actually biblical, some of the things that we carry out. Because we're supposed to be working towards God's created order. Okay? All right. So, all of that to be said, we're going to talk about dominion then, and what we have done with it and what this passage says. So we're going to talk first about rejected dominion. All right? Rejected dominion. And so let's just look at the first few verses here. I'm going to break these first few into three spaces. Okay? So the first verse says, "I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, that they had no one to comfort them, and power was on the side of their oppressors, but they had no one to comfort them. So, I congratulated the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still living, but better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun." So is he saying people should never be born? No, what he's saying is that this world, this earth, its whole power dynamic is messed up. And people who live in this world are going to be living under a messed up power dynamic, one that has rejected the dominion and the rule of Christ and has rejected God's order. And because of that, there is disproportionate use of God's creation. Simple. When we don't follow God's design and leverage His creation for our own good and we overturn His rule, something gets messed up. And Koheleth is looking at this, I think, as an older man. I think this is Solomon now. Remember, we talked about at the beginning, he had all this stuff in the world. And he had to get all that stuff by ignoring what? Everything else. In fact, he had slaves, he had all these other things, correct? So he himself is an oppressor. And it's very interesting because what he says here is he talked about, remember, in the chapter just before. And then he says, "Then I looked again." Here's the key. He saw it, he's seen it many times before. We've all done it. We've seen it. All of us have seen oppression. Every one of us. Correct? We've seen it. The question is, what do we do once we see it? So for most of his life, he saw it and then forgot about it and moved on doing what he was doing. Correct? But this time he says, "I looked again." I stopped and I took a second look. Right? In purity culture, they'll tell you don't to do that, right, men? Right? Don't take a second look. But in this case, he takes a second look. And he looks at the acts of oppression we've done under the sun, and he says something very interesting. He says, "And I saw the tears." I looked long enough to see the suffering. I saw the tears. It's an old song when I was growing up. It was, I think it's Chicago. "If you see me walking by and the tears are in my eye, look away, baby, look away." Right? Anybody heard that? "I don't want you to see me this way." Come on. Somebody's seen it. Somebody's heard it, right? Yeah, you've heard it. Come on, Peter Gabriel, right? All right, anyways. This is what we typically do. We see suffering and we look away. Yes. Yes. And what do? We walk away. We walk by. We look the other direction. But Koheleth at this point in his life is going, I don't know if I should be looking away all the time. He takes a moment and he reinvestigates what's happening. Really thinks about it for a minute. Phoebe's getting all seriously good in this, yeah. Will there ever be complete equality without Jesus? A great question, Phoebe. And the answer is nope. That's a short answer to a long question. But he's saying, right? He's saying that as I look at this and I see this messed up power dynamic, I realize that as long as this world is what it is, as long as this power dynamic remains the way it is, there is always going to be people who are suffering. And so I had to start asking myself, even as I was reading this, he says there's no one to comfort them. Why is there no one to comfort them? And there's some answers to that based on these power dynamics. There's some answers why there's nobody to comfort the oppressed. All right? And it starts with this power thing. What's power all about anyways? If I have power over you, why do I have power over you? It's probably because I have something, A, that you need, and I have control over what you need. Which requires you then to do what? Submit and be very nice to me, because if you want what you need, you better be nice to me. And I can be very benevolent about it all and act very, very gracious and giving about all of it, but the reality is, without me, you have a problem. And so then I can fool myself into thinking that everyone loves me because, well, guess what? They have to, otherwise they don't eat. They have to, otherwise they don't vote. They have to, otherwise they can't get a mortgage. They have to. And this makes us uncomfortable because this sounds like very liberal talking, but the reality is this was written way long ago, brothers and sisters, where someone said the problem and the reason we have oppression is because we have a messed up power dynamic that isn't in accordance with God's will. And that's a problem. That is a problem. So there's two problems with the way that we've dealt with power, all right? And each of us has power on some level, okay? If you're a parent, you got power, all right? All right. We reject dominion, God's dominion, when we start to make power something that we can hold over another human being, because that was never God's design. And so the first reason that we have oppression, just listen to me. This is what I'm saying. What Koheleth is saying is the reason we have oppression is because we do have a messed up power dynamic. Humans are no longer co-rulers. All right? There's a change in the power dynamic. All right? This is the first thing that happens. All right? So in Genesis 3:16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. Once again, remember we talked about last week that God will allow for something for a given time? Just because he allows for it doesn't mean that he agrees with it. In other words, he says, I'm going to allow you to be in childbirth. I'm going to allow these things to happen. There's a time for everything, right? And he shall rule over you. This isn't God's design, it's God's recognition that this is what sin is going to do, and I'm going to allow for it. And at that very moment, power came into play. Humans, they were no longer having dominion over creation together, they were now having dominion over one another. One of them was going to be God to the other, and that was not God's design. Okay? So that's the first thing that happens. When we understand why is there oppression, because you and I hold power over each other, and not just hold power over each other, keep power over each other. Have a really hard time giving up power. So if I could give up power to make your life better, that would be really great, except that would mean I would have to give up power. And I don't like it. I don't like it. I don't like giving up power. I don't like giving up privilege. I don't like giving up my position. I don't like any of that. I want you to have everything your heart desires as long as it takes nothing from me. I want you to be really great, and I want everything to go really well for you as long as I get to keep in my space. As long as I continue to be benevolent to you, but I can keep my power. This happens in interpersonal dynamics all the time. It happens in marriages. It happens in friendships. It happens everywhere. It happens in ministry over and over and over again. I'm retiring, but I want my office, and I want to still have a say in everything, and I want to show up every Sunday, and if anything goes wrong, I'm still going to be the one who tells everybody what to do. Because letting go of my power is too much. It's too much. We hate it when someone else has dominion over us. But we love it when we get to call the shots. That's why our titles matter so much to us. Even in ministry, how many times I've heard, well, you got to call me lead pastor or this kind of pastor or that pastor, and all of it signals something about power. I'm not saying that we won't have it. We'll get to that in a second. But listen, the first reason, the primary reason we have oppression is because we have determined that we should rule over one another when that's God's job. We do that interpersonally, but we also do that on a larger reality. So when we look at Ecclesiastes 4, 1 through 3, he's not just talking about interpersonal dynamics. He's actually talking about governing systems. He's looking and he's saying whole people groups, right, are being oppressed. And so that's something we don't like to talk about either, right? Well, not whole people groups aren't oppressed. I don't oppress you. Yeah, but you didn't give up any power or privilege so that they wouldn't be oppressed. No, you're not actively oppressing somebody, but you certainly aren't ready to give up your position of comfort for them. Sorry. I want the best for them, as long as it doesn't take the best from me. And this whole power dynamic, right, this is where it meant, so that there's this humans ruling over other humans, and then there's this humans ruling over is the change in power structure. So in 1 Samuel 8, it just becomes very clear, right? This is just God's extension from the garden. It says, and because the people say they want a king to rule over them. They want a person to rule over them. And God said, and the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people regarding all that they say to you, because they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. They have rejected my dominion. Okay, can I just say this real quick? This is why you should never have a man of God or a woman of God who makes all the decisions for your life. They are not your king, or they shouldn't be anyways. God should be your king. And the moment we put people in a position that only God should occupy, oppression happens. Why? Because people aren't God. People are people. Just like life gonna life, people gonna people. Even the best person you know, if you put them in the position of God, will take advantage of someone else. People gonna people. So God says to Samuel, they have rejected me from being king over them, like all the deeds they have done since the day that I brought them from Egypt, even to this day, and that they have abandoned me, what? And served other gods, so they are doing to you as well. Now then, listen to their voice, however. You shall warn them strongly and tell them of the practice of the king who will reign over them. What does he tell them? What does Samuel tell them? King's going to take your kids, take your money, going to make you miserable, going to exert his force over you. Sounds like government to me. Same thing. And listen, what he's pushing here and what he's going to push and what you're hearing from me, you're going, oh, great. Now we're talking about communism. Not democracy. Democracy is the greatest. Democracy is God-sent. It is not. Democracy is still people choosing people to rule over them. And no, I'm not advocating for communism or socialism. I am not. Why? Because literally, socialism, right? is more biblical on the outside looking in. The problem is it still requires people to be in charge of who gets what. I am not advocating for democracy or communism. I'm not advocating for capitalism or socialism or free market. We're going to see that in a second, why all that stuff is messed up. I am advocating for a return to theocracy. I'm advocating for us to be submitted to God in whatever spaces that we are in, but allowing Him to rule over us. Allowing Him to have the ability to tell us what we give to whom and when. The ability for Him to tell us when we encourage and equip and empower. I'm advocating for a return to theocracy, where God chooses for us who gets what and when. Not socialism, theocracy. And from the outside, people might think that's what we're doing. But when I read Acts 2, I see a theocracy in work, in progress. People selling when they needed to sell, and equipping when they needed to equip, and doing what they needed to do to ensure one group was not put underneath the foot of another. Time and time again, what do you see the Apostle Paul doing? Ensuring that Jews did not make Gentiles second class. Time and time again. That's why he said, in God's kingdom, in God's economy, there is not Jew or Greek, male or female. There is child of God. And so the roots of oppression, it's all self-centered, by the way. And all I'm doing is calling out what he put on the page here. I'm not even saying these are all, I'm not even giving you a temp. I'm just saying this is what he calls out. Humans holding and keeping power and privilege over other humans. If we didn't have people doing this, we wouldn't have oppression. I'm just being honest, right? If we didn't have humans having power over other humans, but listen, I realize that some of us are going to be put in positions of authority, even biblically, but biblically, that authority is what? To empower others. But we hold and keep our power and our privilege over other people. And then we have oppression. The second phase in this, in Ecclesiastes 4:4-6, he says, and I have seen, what is the other reason? Why is no one there to comfort those? One is because the comforting part, it challenges the power dynamic that we prefer to keep. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is this. I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a person and his neighbor. This too is futility and striving after the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after the wind. Why don't we take care of the oppressed? We are too busy trying to get more. I can't stop and help you if I got to do more to get more. That's what he's saying. And I have to get more. Why? Because I need that power that somebody else has, like that power of influence. It's still power, folks. The power of stuff, whatever it is. The power of someone else knowing that I have all that they have. There is this race to the finish. Phoebe, that's so awesome. Sorry, every once in a while I have to check back on what they're saying. I love this so good. She's like, Israel wanted a king so bad when they were the ones with the best king in the universe. That's amen. That's exactly right. Let me unpack this just for a second because I know we have to go quickly today. But he says, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Now what does that mean? He's saying that, you know what? A fool doesn't work and has to eat himself or herself and consumes and dies. However, at least that person doesn't hurt anybody else. He's not saying, and he says, then the one 2 fists full of labor and striving after the wind is actually a worse position than that person. But the better one is the one who works and has a handful of rest. Well, what does rest say? Rest understands. It puts trust in God. Rest, and that's all written into the Bible, rest is the time when we honor and acknowledge who really does have dominion and authority. It's not us achieving it with this great mandate to go across the world, but rather it is God in His time who gives in His good time those things that we consume. Rest is an acknowledgement of God's sovereignty. It's an acknowledgement of our trust. If we have no rest, if you can't stop for a minute to rest and see oppression and know that that's not God's design, we have a problem. And he says that this is the problem. We are too busy trying to overcome someone else, too busy trying to get someone else's power. And I'll tell you this way, brothers and sisters, this is not the way I'll keep it on a governmental level, and I'm going to get a little bit of trouble right here. I don't care. I've been in trouble lots in my life. Being an American, all right, coming to Canada, encountering Canadians, all right, when we talk about rivalry and envy, and we talk about all these things, okay, I'm telling you, I grew up, I didn't learn that there was such a thing as a prime minister till I went to university and met a Canadian. I didn't know there was even such a thing as Jean Chrétien till somebody told me there was somebody called Jean Chrétien. I couldn't name the provinces. I couldn't tell you capitals. I didn't know any of that, but I knew everything that ever happened, all right, in the U.S. of A. All right? And I'll tell you why I didn't care about Canada, because the U.S. of A. had all the power anyways. There was nothing we could glean or gain from Canada. There was no envy of Canada. I'm just telling you that. I'm not telling you that's how I feel right now. I'm just saying that was a thought process. And it wasn't even a thought process. Why didn't we not even think about it? Because we already had the power. We already had the influence. We were already in a place. Now when it came to China, totally different deal. Now let's flip the script. You know how many times I have sat and listened to Canadians degrade the United States of America, all that they do and all that they are, and they are picking on America and how dumb Americans are. It's envy. The U.S. of A. has something that Canadians wish they did have, but they just degrade. And I'm not saying, I'm just telling you, I'm trying to keep it unpersonal. I'm trying to just have you think about something for a minute. Because you don't care about Mexico. You like going there. You want to know why? Could you go there? You're powerful. But whatever Mexico's doing, it doesn't bother you too much. Let's talk about China for a second, right? China, the communists, made in China. Look at the back of the thing, made in China. All right, but you know what? Well, I don't want anything made in China, but if those Cubans make me a cigar, I'm going to smoke that. Do you understand what I'm saying? We think that we're not in this, but we're in this. Like on a day-to-day real level, we are in this. As countries, as individuals, we fall into this place. And this is where oppression comes from. Because I am so busy looking at what the United States is doing that I'm not even paying attention to the suffering that's happening in Mexico. I'm so busy trying to get China to stop making goods and bring manufacturing back to the United States that I'm not even paying attention to the fact that people are suffering in Cuba. Told you I'm going to get in trouble. Roots of oppression. Humans holding and keeping power and privilege over the humans. And then second, humans striving for power and influence over other humans. That's what my life is about, man. Bigger house. Bigger business. Bigger influence. Better school. More money. Ecclesiastes 4, 7 through 8. I got to go fast now. Then I looked again at the futility under the sun. There was a man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom do I labor and deprive myself of pleasure? This too is futility, and it is an unhappy task. Okay, I'll just skip right to the point here. Third thing, humans wielding all of their power and influence to get themselves through today and make themselves safe for tomorrow. Maybe you aren't somebody who really cares about keeping up with the Joneses or somebody who really cares about having power, but what you care about is you. And making sure you're okay and your family's okay and getting ourselves through today and making sure we're safe tomorrow, saving ourselves, whatever it may be, making sure I've got money. I watched a movie with my son the other day, and this guy prophesied. I'm telling you, he didn't prophesy literally. He was not a Christian. But he prophesied that said, I don't need to make friends, I need to make money. And I will sell my business someday, and I will watch wherever I am. One is the loneliest number. This man did sell his business for billions. And it showed this shot of him eating at a restaurant by himself. He made it through today. He made himself safe for tomorrow. And that's all that mattered. And for many of us, we are so myopic, that's all we think about. How am I going to get through today? What am I going to eat tomorrow? That's it. That's all I care about. But 1 Corinthians 12 gives us this thing as we look forward. It says, for the body is not one part but many. I want you to start thinking a minute, because what is the answer to self-centeredness? If these are the roots of oppression, what are the roots of revival? What are the roots, all right, of freedom? What are the roots of those things? For the body is not one part but many. If the foot says, because I am not a hand, I am not a part of the body, if it's not for this reason any less a part of the body. And if the ear says, because I am not an eye, I am not a part of the body, it is not for this reason any less a part of the body. You can say that you are not at fault or that you're not a part of all of these things, and yet you are. We are all connected. As a global community, as a church community, we are not islands. We live that way, but we are not. And so I have some questions to ask you. These are the questions you should be asking yourself as you go through your day. This is how we start to change this oppression. We start to change this rejected dominion. We have to start asking ourselves these questions. How did what I do today affect others? Do you ever even ask yourself that question? I'm just asking. How is what I am doing right now going to affect others? Some of you, this is a big question. Like this is beyond the way you think. Who is benefiting from my life other than me and my family? If I asked you that question, what would your answer be? Am I working in community to see kingdom culture come to life? This is where we start to get. This is where we get redeemed dominion. All right? And I will go as quickly as possible and still get honorably through God's word. Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12, two are better than one because they have a good return for. This is his answer to all of that. This is Kohelet's answer to all of that he saw, took a second look, all of the tears, all these people striving for power, for wealth, for influence. He says, you end up alone like that guy with no dependents sitting at the table. That's where you end up with with a trail behind you. And he says, that guy sitting at the table is poor. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. Think about it for a second. Because it's just not for me, it's for us. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion, but woe to the one who falls when there is not another one to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of three strands is not quickly torn apart. I know that this has been co-opted into a marriage verse. This is not about marriage. It is zero about marriage. He is building a defense that community is the only way we break oppression. It's going back to the power dynamics that God designed, working for and with each other, not against each other. And so he begins to build this. That's why it goes at the end. That's why it goes from two can resist. But you know what's even better? Three. And yes, we can use all these things in these marriage ceremonies, and they're correct, but I'm just telling you that wasn't the intention when he wrote it. I was reading this from this commentary, and I just wanted to share it with you. It's from Amy Planting-Kapow. It says, Kohelet's response to oppression, envy, and selfishness is to commend concrete forms of human solidarity. Working together, lifting one another up, keeping one another warm, and defending one another. Let me see if you can find oppression in those actions. Do you understand what I'm saying now? If we work together, we lift one another up, we keep one another warm, and we defend one another, find oppression there. So what are the roots of kingdom culture? We talk about kingdom culture. What are the roots of kingdom culture? What are the roots of community? Humans sharing privileges and empowering other humans to live freely under God's rule. Yeah, I've been given a certain level of authority as a pastor. Sure. How do I use that? To empower others to do greater things than myself, or to make sure that they grow only so much as to remain subservient and beneficial to me? Is there a big difference? I can tell you that. I can be at a church for one day, and I can tell you what kind of church it is. Humans sharing privileges and empowering other humans to live freely under God's rule. Not mine, not the government's, God's. Will that mean that we adhere to the government sometimes? Sure, because the Bible tells us to be, if at all possible, be at peace with all men. But I'm not being subservient to a government. I'm being subservient to my God who placed me in this place. That's theocracy. That's why we have to rethink. We align Christian with different forms of government and economic devices. But that's not how it works. Capitalism, socialism, democracy, communism, they are not God-ordained. They are human institutions built by humans, governed by humans, empowered by humans, directed by humans, and they will fail. And no matter which one you use and which one you walk in, without God calling the shots, there will be oppression. You can go to any free market society and find people who don't have. You can go to any democratic nation and find people who are oppressed. It is only under God's divine rule that we return to a non-oppressive state. Humans sharing privileges and empowering other humans to live freely under God's rule. Am I looking at how my power can be used to help someone else? Even if it means I lose some of it myself. 2, humans encouraging their brothers and sisters to grow in the power and the love of the Holy Spirit. Cheering one another on. Not competing with one another, and blessing one another as a gathered community. Woo! You did it! You did it! You did it! Man, you did. Hey, you worked hard. You did get. I'm so glad that you got that house. I'm glad. Let's make sure that God governs that home. Man, I'm glad for you. Humans submitted to the power of God's rule in love and obedience, trusting Him to supply all the. Because if I trust God to supply all my needs, if I have my handful of rest that reminds me of His sovereignty, what am I free to do? So that they can work to love their neighbors and build the kingdom. I have time for you because the keeper of time holds me. Mark 12. All this is Jesus, just so you know. Koheleth is speaking what Jesus is going to tell us all. One of the scribes came up and heard them arguing, recognized what he had answered them well, asked him, what commandment is the foremost of all? Jesus answered, the foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. What? He is the one who has all dominion. So what should you do? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. What is that saying? I am governed, obedient to, I follow God. It is God's ordained way for me to live under Him. Under Him. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself, or as I say, in place of yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Can you find me? I'm asking you right now. Can you find me any way that there could be oppression if we all lived this way? Help me understand. Because we have a lot of, listen, there are a lot of programs in place, and I think these programs are good. I'm going to tell you why, because the world is still full of human beings who won't do what God says. Just want you to know that. But all of these programs will never eliminate oppression. The only thing that eliminates oppression is a people who are under God living for God. Not for themselves, but for His kingdom. And so how do we change this thing? We start living that way. Because it is the church itself, had they done what they were supposed to do with the power and the influence they got, that could have changed this world forever. But instead, relished the power. Once they finally overcame, relished the power of being in rule and authority. Almost done. Romans 12, 9 through 21, I'll read this, and then we'll read the last verse and we'll finish. We'll be done in 6 minutes. Love must be free of hypocrisy. Detest what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. I don't know if I can say this any clearer, but the answer to changing things is growing together in unity as a community. Centered around Jesus Christ, doing what He says when He says it, selling what He says when He says, buying what He says when He says, giving what He says when He says. Give preference to one another in honor. Not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never repay evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all people. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is redeemed dominion. It's trusting God and living for others, not for ourselves. It ends with this kind of parable of sorts, because this is what happens so often for us. We get to this place where we're like, yes, I yield to God, and then we try to take it back. We reach back up for dominion, we go back for that fruit. Reach one more time. Because that's where this all started, right? It all started with that bite of that fruit that rejected God's dominion. It all started right there. And we get this idea, and we know what we're supposed to do, and we start building a community, and we start advancing. And you know what? Because we've done that, people start to kind of, they do love us, and they kind of give us this power, and then all of a sudden, we're reaching back. And so often, it's us being pushed down to this place of nothing. You hear what I'm saying? Where we need people. That we start to go back to living for each other. And then we start gaining influence and power and money. And before you know it, we done ate that thing again. And for some of you today, you need to be reminded that you got to stop reaching for that fruit. It's not going to end well. You need to get back to living for something other than you. So he ends it by saying this: a poor yet wise youth is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all those living under the sun move to the side of the second youth who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them. Even the ones who will come after will not be happy with him, for this too is futility and striving after the wind. I'll try to unpack that quickly just so you guys can hear it. But essentially, I think there's some reflections of David in this. There's some reflections of David. You can see some reflections of David, of Absalom, of the whole thing. And being Solomon, you can understand that. Stop the share, please. You can understand that, right? And he's talking about how you see this king who came to power. Can we stop the share, please? You see this king who's come to power, right? And he came from lowly spaces. So I see a picture of a shepherd boy, right? Who was a reject and became someone that was being, put in prison, and he was all of these things, right? And yet he built this band of brothers, didn't he? He built these. they're like the rejects, right? That's what they do. They're the rejects. But he binds them together, and he does amazing things. I don't know if you've ever really read about David but he does things that nobody at that time would do. So even though he's the leader, listen to this. I didn't even think about this. Just praise you. I didn't even think about this just now. There was a reason for it. I know sometimes you guys can't understand because you're not in my head. But God was like, don't prepare this part. I'm going to tell you when you get there. David leads this group of people. And what that looked like in that time was if you were the leader and you guys got stuff, you got the stuff. And you kind of threw a few measly things to others just to make sure they survived. Because they needed you then. But David didn't roll like that. Whenever they got something, he divided it with everybody equally. Absolutely equally. And you know what? The group grew and grew and grew because people heard, this dude's fair. He's fair. And so even though there was a king, and even though Saul was after him, like he was protected time and time again, taken care of. He had to do some weird stuff, but he survived it all. To the point where that group got so big and so influential that David went from being a rejected shepherd boy, right, to a king of a nation. And he did it, yes, because God ordained him and because God anointed him and all those other things. But he did it because he understood and lived for other people, with them, for them, in community. And no sooner does he gain this great privilege and honor, which for him should have been a platform to continue this communal living, this way to make God's grace extend to all the earth. I have no doubt that would have been God's desire. That David, from that position of power, would have used his influence to exert change across the world. But before you know it, when he's supposed to do what he's supposed to do, he stays home and takes care of him. And now Uriah's dead. And now he's not paying attention to the bad things that are happening in his own house. And before you know it, this guy who built all of this off of working with other people is on the throne by himself, eating dinner. And just a few weeks after all of this, I know I'm taking years and condensing them into like one story. He's leaving his throne with insults being hurled at him by the commoners as his son Absalom takes over because his son stood by the gate and listened to the oppressed. Brothers and sisters, we need to take another look. We need to take another look. Not in the mirror, not at what we lack. We need to take another look at the tears of the oppressed. And we need to ask whether or not we truly understand what it means to fight for a theocracy, to fight for dominion in the proper place, the higher lifting up the lower, just as Jesus showed us when he went from heaven to hell. so that we could go from hell to heaven.